right. Well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to have everybody joining us today. We have a really fun panel just in time for Independence Day. So we are doing Politics and Patriotism featuring textiles from the Helen, Louise, Allen Textile Collection. I am Melissa Ralsted. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. And we're really excited to have everybody join us for our Friday panels, our Friday lunchtime chats. These programs are free, but we do ask that you, if you're able to please make a donation so that we can continue to offer these programs for free. As you can imagine, it's been a little tricky and a little difficult for the museum being closed. We have reopened, but every donation counts no matter what the amount. So we do really appreciate it. I'm also really excited today to be joined by our 4 panelists. So all of whom are from the Center for Design and Material Culture. So the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection is a part of the Center for Design and Material Culture within the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I hope I got that right. So I'll introduce the 4 of them, and then I'm going to turn things over to them and let them share what their research is all about. So today we have joining us Samantha Comerford, who is a second-year Master of Arts student in the Art History Department at UW-Madison, where she also works as a collections assistant within the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection. So thank you very much for joining us, Samantha. Marina Moskovitz is the Lynn and Gary Mecklenburg Chair in Textiles, Material Culture, and Design in the School of Human Ecology at UW-Madison, where she incorporates the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection into her teaching and research. So happy to have you with us too. And then Nora Rennick Reinhardt is an MFA student in Design Studies at UW-Madison. Her hybrid practice includes textile art, teaching, and curating. So welcome. And then our final panelist is Natalie Wright. She is a Design History PhD student at UW-Madison, where she researches connections between decorative arts and disability. So we're really happy to have all of you with us. And with that, I'm going to step back and turn things over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Melissa and Emily and Devin, for this great opportunity to partner on your lunchtime chat. This series has been such a great idea to connect the community during these unusual times. And I want to also thank all of you who are attending, who we can't actually see, but I know you're out there in the ether. We're really grateful for this opportunity to share kind of a small glimpse of the collection. And we hope that we'll have more chances to do so in person in the future. We're going to be talking today about an exhibit that the 4 of us have been working on this year. And I'm going to give a little bit of background of sort of how it got started and how we're thinking about organizing it. And then my 3 co-panelists are going to take a kind of deeper dive into some of the objects that we're looking at. I have now been in residence in Madison for about 2 years, and I've been slowly but surely getting to know this incredible collection that we have on site in the School of Human Ecology. And my background, both as an academic and as a museum curator, is in American cultural history. So I was really interested to find some evocations of American politics among the collection. And I'm actually just going to ask Natalie to flip the first slide. This is a 1840 silk handkerchief that is a piece from William Henry Harrison's presidential campaign. He ran as a Whig candidate. And this election is generally considered sort of the first American presidential election that had what we now kind of would think of as political ephemera. So now we think of maybe, bumper stickers or buttons, but here this handkerchief was a very typical way that people would get the word out about particular candidates, sort of for the first few elections after this one in 1840. And this is a really remarkable thing to have in the collection. You can see it's maybe not in the absolute best shape, but we're very proud to have such an early example of this type of political ephemera. And this piece in particular really sort of got my mind worrying, particularly about I guess, a little more than a year ago when the Democratic National Convention was announced to be in Milwaukee. And a few of us just started to think about, are there ways that we can tie the textile collection into this political moment that's kind of starting off on our doorstep and then obviously turning into a national election season. And so I set about recruiting some graduate students, and I'm very happy that these three great women answered my call to spend some time researching what we could find in the collection that might make an interesting exhibit about textiles and American politics. For obvious reasons, we've had to make some adjustments to our schedule, and we're still hoping to have an in-person exhibit at such point where we feel like it's safe to do that. But in the meantime, we've been sort of working together all year and exploring the collection and learning from these textiles, and we're really happy to have this opportunity to present some of our kind of work in progress in this interim way. Our starting point, which is proving to be an ongoing discussion, was really how do we define politics, and therefore how do we define political textiles? And we wanted this definition to be broad enough to encompass a range of interesting objects, but not so broad as to basically lose all meaning. And so while the earliest spark might have been an object like this one that's tied to a particular person and presidential campaign, we've been thinking more broadly about the arena of civic engagement that people take part in, and places where power of various forms is both wielded and contested. We've talked a lot about key themes of participation and representation. Who participates and how? Who is represented and how? And that's a really important question in the political arena. And even when we started this project last September, obviously there was no way that we could know how timely that discussion would prove to be at this point. So this is a really interesting moment to have this conversation with all of you. But we also thought that participation and representation are important questions in the consideration of textiles. So who makes these textiles? Who uses them? How might these acts be political? And who or what are represented, either literally or symbolically, on the textiles or through them? What's the relationship between kind of the personal space of making and using textiles, which can be very intimate objects, and the civic space of how these might be displayed or shown, or what messages they might encompass. So when we started this project, we had a long discussion about wanting to show how textiles had a role in the civic space. And I'll confess that we talked about what we didn't want to do. And we felt like there was a sort of already well-worn path about women finding some sort of political voice within the domestic sphere through the making of textiles. And that's a really important story to tell and an important message, but we also felt like it was a story that had been told. However, sometimes things don't work out as you think they're going to. So as we started really surveying the textile collection and thinking about the broad umbrella of politics, we realized how many of the artifacts were things that we would classify as domestic in some way. Quilts, coverlets, pillowcases, home furnishing fabrics that might be used for upholstery or window treatments, and even these things like handkerchiefs that have an interesting association with the body. And still, these can be really overtly political objects. And again, I'm going to ask Natalie just to flip the slide. So this is a pillow cover from the collection. It's from around 1918, when the United States entered World War I. And this was one of the first objects that we looked at together. I think in a contemporary context, the slogan is quite provocative, and we were really trying to kind of think about, well, what did this slogan mean in its own day? What do these symbols mean? It's a very interesting textile in that it has different kinds of printing on fabric, and I have a couple of details here. You can see there's a sort of photographic printing at the bottom that shows a military scene. There's printmaking at the top, and if you look closely, you can see the white stars are actually printed sort of slightly out of register on top of some outlines that are in that blue field. It's a little hard to tell in this photograph, but it's a very sort of shiny, satiny fabric with this elaborate fringe. And so on the one hand, this seems like quite a strong military, overtly political message. And then on the other hand, it's this very kind of decorative object that seems to take a kind of intimate place in the home. And we were really interested in those conjunctions. And so I think somewhat to our own surprise, we wound up sort of embracing this idea of the domestic space, but trying to think about it slightly differently about how the domestic space and civic space actually overlap. So we wound up organizing our ideas for the exhibit around kind of 4 homes, so to speak, 4 domestic settings. And I'll just run through these really quickly with a couple of examples for each. I'm not going to talk too much about each of these textiles because otherwise you would never hear from anyone else. But I'll just give you a little taster, and we're all happy to answer more questions about these particular objects at the end. So the 4 homes are roughly chronological and also thematic. So we start with this federal home where we display objects from around the time of American independence up to about the middle of the 19th century. We're stretching some of our historical categories a little bit. And this here, the idea of domestic is twofold. Sometimes these are objects made or used within sort of familial domestic settings, but there's also a lot of import put on domestic in the national sense, and sort of starting a political economy for the new nation, and textiles being part of that, and with various sort of national symbols being incorporated into the textiles, whether personages, as you see this commemorative handkerchief featuring George Washington, or symbols such as the eagle in the corners of this woven coverlet that we're going to hear a little bit more about later. So our next setting is the progressive home. And though the progressive era of American history usually refers to the decades kind of on either side of the turn of the 20th century, we're stretching that a little bit to incorporate a range of textiles that in a variety of ways document the spirit of political reform that were the hallmark of that era. So we see here again, a kind of campaign handkerchief or bandana that's promoting the Progressive Party and Theodore Roosevelt's run for the presidency in 1912. And there are also some World War I era objects in this particular section, like this cotton handkerchief that says "Greetings from Camp Logan, Texas." But we also have some other objects that deal more with kind of issues of social reform. And Natalie's going to be talking about one of those more in a minute. We then looked at the revival home, and here we really had a question about whether whether portraying national history is always a form of politics or not. It's a question we'd be eager for your views on. But we were really interested in different instances, really stretching probably from about the point of the Centennial in 1876 to the Bicentennial in 1976. So quite a long period of time, but one in which different kinds of imagery of the American past is deployed are deployed in textiles. And we think that that carries a certain kind of political messaging to it. So I have a couple of examples here from those kind of 2 ends of the historical trajectory. And one is it's a pillow cover that it is on the one hand commemorating the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, but that event in itself was commemorating the Louisiana Purchase, actually of 1803, although this pillow cover says 1804 to 1904, but that's fair enough. So the buildings that you see at the bottom are images of the St. Louis World's Fair, but then we have these images of Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson to kind of show this historic relationship between the United States and France over time. And the other images from 1976, possibly 1977, a number of the major fabric companies in the United States issued a range of prints that in some way spoke to the bicentennial. In this example, the Philadelphia Toile by Waverly Fabrics is one great example of that. And then finally, we're looking at a range of artifacts that we're grouping together under the title The Activist Home. And this does overlap temporally a bit with the revival, which is quite interesting. But most of the works are from World War II forward and focus on textiles that, rather than invoking the past, really comment on the current events of their day, often from the perspective of a particular identity. So we have one more campaign item here, but in a little bit of a different form. This is actually a big piece of furnishing fabric that says "I like Ike," referring to Dwight Eisenhower in this kind of amazing typescript. And we've seen some pictures of this used as apparel fabric, but I think the piece in our collection maybe was destined for furnishing fabric. It's a little hard to tell. And then a piece that's one of a whole range of objects we have by the artist Matilda Schwalbach, who taught in our school. This is a really interesting sort of printing sample that shows certain motifs that she uses frequently. And here we have this kind of range from red to blue. And it's an image that on the one hand is a sort of looks like a ball of wool or something domestic in that sense. And then on the other hand, it's a little hard to tell at this scale, but there are stars either beneath or on top of those stripes. And she uses this motif in a variety of ways and incorporated into a variety of textiles that speak to issues of women's rights in the late 1960s. So this sort of gives you a range of the types of objects. And I wanted to give you that overview of how we're approaching the exhibit, but we're actually going to do something a little bit different today and really look at some of the cross-cutting themes. So first, Natalie's going to walk us through one really amazing case study and sort of show how textiles can be considered political. And then Sam is going to hone in on one particular symbol that we've seen tie together many of the textiles that we've looked at. And then Nora is going to focus a little bit more on making as a political act. And I'm going to come in for a couple minutes at the end to talk about collecting. So I'll hand over to Natalie.
Thank you so much,
Natalie. Oh, if I could interject one quick thing. If you have questions, please use the chat feature and let us know. We can ask the panelists the questions as we go. So, you know, we'd love this to be a conversation with you too. So, all right, sorry, Natalie.
No problem. Thank you so much, Marina. Hopefully I'm speaking loudly enough and everybody can hear me. As Marina said, I'm going to be walking through a case study of one particular political textile in our collection, and that is a crazy quilt. This particular crazy quilt is from roughly 1919, and in case anyone doesn't know what a crazy quilt is, it's a form of quilting in which each block is made of scraps of fabric put together in an aesthetically pleasing kind of patchwork manner. And they're quite like fabric scrapbooks. And this quilt is perhaps even more so because it's made of pieces of silk as well as political ribbons. And in fact, there are about 65 political ribbons in total. Ribbons can be found in US politics in the early 19th century, and they actually start their overall decline at the end of the 19th century with the production of political buttons, as we're still familiar with today. This quilt has political ribbons from 1892 to 1919, which is fairly late for both political ribbons and this form of crazy quilt too. There are some really interesting strategies that I wanted to draw your attention to that the maker used. One was that she used at least one ribbon in each block, the most being 4, but more often 2 or 3, to make sure that the ribbons were evenly distributed. Another is that both Democrat and Republican ribbons are present. In some cases, the maker specifically mixed Republican and Democrat ribbons. And on this particular square, for example, she placed a ribbon showing Republican presidential nominees William McKinley and Garrett Hobart near to a National Democratic Convention ribbon from 1869 in Chicago. And it's quite difficult to see, but the small ribbon with the silver text is the Democratic Convention ribbon. This choice, to me at least, is curious because the maker had the ribbon for the Democrat nominees from that convention, William J. Bryan and Vice President Arthur Sewall, which are in a different square, this one that you can see now. The overall effect that this produces, I think, is to show someone who's really civically engaged across party lines. The year remaining visible on the ribbons was also important enough to the maker that she sometimes created gaps in her stitching around the pieces so that the date was not covered up, like on this example where she made sure not to stitch over the year 1894. I'm not sure if you can see that, but on the bottom right-hand corner, she's stopped and started her stitching right near that date. And keeping the dates visible also allowed the maker to juxtapose ribbons from different decades in the same quilt block, which again shows this really prolonged civic engagement. And another strategy that the maker employed was to specifically choose the color of the thread for her feather stitching around ribbons to underscore their meaning. And she does so especially with red, white, and blue stitching around several ribbons as an added show of performative patriotism. And I really like the example on the far left in particular, where on the top of the American flag fabric, she's changed midway through from red to blue. So 2 ribbons, 1 year apart, have text from a typewriter that reads, E.S. Baker, Mayor of Portage, Wisconsin. It could be that someone in Baker's family made the quilt, which is what textile scholar Beverly Gordon posited in her chapter, Embodying Family and Community Life in a Crazy Quilt. By researching E.S. Baker further, I think I was able to confirm this hypothesis. Municipality records do indicate that E.S. Baker, which stood for Edmund Baker, was mayor of Portage in 1905, and a newspaper article in 1908 indicates that he lost his seat. He was also district attorney and chairman of the Democratic County Committee in 1917. And while the ribbons range in location, showing the maker's activity in organizations across Wisconsin and the Midwest, a total of 12 ribbons relate to Portage, Wisconsin, and 5 ribbons relate to Columbia County, which contains Portage, showing a heavy representation of that area. Additionally, the quilt includes a total of 16 AOUW ribbons over the span of nearly 30 years, more than any other organization, showing the maker's strong ties to the work and mission of that particular charity. The AOUW, or Ancient Order of United Workmen, was a fraternal organization that provided social and political support after the American Civil War. As Baker was 13 when the Civil War started and 17 when it was over, and his wife Isabella was even younger, is unlikely that he served, but it is likely, I think we can say, that the war shaped both of their childhoods significantly. Baker is recorded as being an active member of the AOUW and its leadership in newspaper articles on 2 occasions, once in 1885 and then again 10 years later in 1895. Baker was also recorded as a Freemason, which helps to explain a few of the Masonic ribbons. And additionally, 4 ribbons for Methodist events appear on the quilt, such as for the Epworth League, which was related to the Methodist Church, or this Portage Methodist Church's Gentleman's Supper for Washington's birthday in 1889, which do seem to indicate that this was the couple's faith. Interestingly, his childhood and adult life helped to also explain the Columbia County Agricultural Society ribbons, which show how he moved up in the organization, first as secretary, then superintendent, and then president. And I know that it's really difficult to see, but on the ribbon in the image that's on the far right, it actually does say that the text reads Columbia County Agricultural Society President. In a 1919 article in the Baraboo Weekly News, Baker described growing up working as a crop laborer for the famed Scottish-American naturalist John Muir. When Muir sold his estate, Baker purchased some of his tools, and then which he treasured and kept on a different plot of land, which was this space. In 1918, the Madison Capital Times reported that Baker was farming the land at the historic Indian Agency House, where he lived with his family. This house, which still stands today as a federal-style house museum that some of you may have visited, is a relic of white settler colonialism in Wisconsin. The house was built in 1832 for John and Juliet Kinsey to work as government liaisons to the Ho-Chunk people. The erasure of the Ho-Chunk people and their history is pretty apparent in the Madison Capital Times article, which calls this house, quote, the oldest and most historic home in Portage, end quote. Baker himself was also made to embody this colonialism when, in 1919, the Baraboo Weekly News called him, quote, the first white person born in the town of Fort Winnebago, end quote. His birth year, 1848, was also coincidentally the year in which Wisconsin became a state. In the 1918 Madison Capital Times report, Baker and his wife Isabella gave tours of their home to historians who traveled for the occasion from across the state. And it is in this home that we might imagine the crazy quilt and how Isabella may have showed off her handiwork to guests. Isabella was born in New York, and she moved to Portage at a young age. She is documented as being in Fort Winnebago, Wisconsin by the age of 14. But we know that she was there at least 4 years earlier, as she told the Baraboo Weekly News that she attended school in Wisconsin in roughly 1867, when she would have been about 10 years old. Her school instructor was Joanna Muir, who was John Muir's sister. Edmund and Isabella married in 1874 and together had 4 children. While the 1880 census lists her profession as keeping house, the 1910 census, on the other hand, lists her as a nurse for a private family. This information could change our interpretation of this particular quilt block, in which a pharmaceutical ribbon is near the E.S. Baker mayoral ribbon. By placing these 2 ribbons together, Isabella may have put a reference to her own work next to the overt evidence of her husband's. Altogether, this quilt paints a really fascinating portrait, I think, of a couple and their family and their place in Wisconsin at the turn of the 20th century. It shows their values as a politically active and civically engaged household, but also how they each played their part in settler colonialism and the related establishment of Wisconsin as a state in the United States. And with that, I am going to hand things over to Samantha.
Hi, thank you, Natalie. And hopefully I'm also speaking clearly and loudly enough for everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit today about some of the symbols, and specifically one symbol that came up in our searches. Within the collection, we have about 13,000 objects, and it can be very difficult to find specific objects that you're looking for within that sometimes. And so when we first began searching for objects that might become a part of this exhibition, we started with kind of some key terms that we felt would link objects to the political sphere. So Natalie, we can start with that first object slide. And one of those objects that we searched for was the eagle. And we immediately found that there are many, many eagles in the collection. And often when you search for eagles within our collection, they are very linked to textiles that represent different American iconography. Specifically, the eagle often looks like this. So the eagle became the national symbol during the Second Continental Congress on June 20th, 1782, and has since proliferated across different objects. It's often seen next to American flags on them, and even as a stand-in for them. And there's no doubt that this is a symbol to many of us of the US and something that's deeply embedded. And in our initial searches, it was just startling how this showed up on so many different textiles that were made with a variety of processes. And so that became very interesting. This specific piece is a 7-inch diameter lace mat. And it was likely produced as a piece of war lace in Belgium during the First World War. So the dates that are on this piece we are unsure about, that we currently have it cataloged under. And we have several other mats like this one in the collection that depict other national emblems of countries across Europe and that may have been involved in the First World War. So this even further connects this object into those ideas of patriotism and even nationalism. And one question that came up for us in thinking about that patriotism and nationalism was, is patriotism always political? In the beginning, Marina kind of referenced these ideas of historical representations and whether those are political. And I think that same question came up in thinking about ideas of patriotism. Often when we were thinking about patriotism, it was often an overt display of American symbology or ideals upon these different textiles. So we can move to the next eagle representation. And I just wanted to run through a few other objects that we found in those initial searches. And those display a variety of other eagle imagery, as you can see here. And this is a handkerchief that was produced between 1947 and 1959. And it depicts different locations, people, and other icons that represent the city of Philadelphia. The title of the handkerchief is City of Brotherly Love. And again, this harkens back to these different Revolutionary War images and things like that, but was produced at a much later time. And in the center of this, upon the Liberty Bell, we can see that eagle looking back. And once again, we have that kind of stars and stripes shield over it. So we can again see that kind of patriotic symbol. And we can move to the next one. We have many handkerchiefs in the collection. And as Marina said, many of them have an interesting political symbols on them. And this is another one. This is a handkerchief titled E Pluribus Unum. And this one has very different imagery from the one before. However, it still has stars and stripes, and it still, again, has that eagle. And this one seems to be in that kind of flying pose as opposed to the looking back, or like we saw earlier in the seal pose, where it's kind of looking to the side with a branch in one hand, the arrows, or in one talon, the arrows in the other. And this one was very interesting. This is a more modern design as opposed to looking back at that other piece, which was more of a revival type handkerchief. And this one was produced between 1930 and 1969. And we can move on to the next.
We do have a question about the handkerchiefs.
Yeah.
So the question is, were people actually using them as handkerchiefs, or were they meant to be decorative items?
So the handkerchiefs that have come into us at the Textile collection, many of them came in as one large donation, and they were collector's objects. The donor was a collector of these handkerchiefs. And any of the other panelists, if you have any ideas about any of this, feel free to jump in. But I do believe they were sort of collector's objects, and the ones that we've seen as political objects often were sort of collectible. And there's this idea of people kind of waving the handkerchief at these kind of political events or rallies, things like that. And I think often they had that kind of relationship to the body. So that kind of waving the handkerchief, we might have an image of that in our minds from different films, things like that. But generally the handkerchiefs that are in our collection are in very good condition. They don't look like they have been used, maybe as one might use a handkerchief. Yeah, generally they seem to be in pretty good shape. And a lot of these kind of political ones we think of as being maybe waved at some kind of event. But I wanted to also display one of the coverlets in our collection because these were very striking. Marina showed a coverlet at the beginning that had some eagles on it. We have several more within the collection that have eagles, and also some fragments of larger coverlets that also have eagles. So this one was produced in 1830, and they're slightly more obscured here within the larger pattern, but we can see them at the top and bottom borders there. And again, they have that striped shield on the chest, arrows in one talon, and some form of flora, probably an olive or laurel branch in the other. While above them are not the usual 13 stars as we saw in that previous mat, but rather just 12. And this could have been an aesthetic decision or something else. I'm not sure as to that. But the other motifs around the coverlet, such as the roosters, schoolhouses, and the central rose motif, are not necessarily political or patriotic, but the inclusion of the eagles changes the way that this piece may have been used or perceived. So that does kind of change things. When we introduce that eagle, it sort of transforms the piece in some ways in our eyes, especially when thinking about curating for this exhibition, certainly. And this is a slightly more fun or subversive object here. This is a crocheted eagle sitting on a nested egg, and you can see that that nested egg actually has a split down the middle, and it opens, and within it is a crocheted globe that looks like the earth. And this piece was created by Virginia Tiffany in 1976. The 1960s and 70s were certainly a period of civil unrest across the country, which was manifest in many of the textiles produced during the period. And we have some of those. You could see Matilda Schwalbach's pieces, and she has several others. But here, Tiffany has utilized very loaded imagery and used crochet to create this floppy and unique eagle piece, which is very different from some of the others that have come up in our searches and which you've seen thus far. While there was unrest, there was also celebration of American iconography in 1976. As well as in preceding years and in those following actually as well. 1976 marked the US bicentennial, and many upholstery and drapery companies as well as designers created inspired designs for this period. Many of these were produced beginning around the 1950s in the post-war years. And as you saw in the beginning when Marina was talking about the revival home, we have many furnishing fabrics from this period that really do depict wallpapers from colonial homes that were reproduced as fabrics that you could use as drapes or as upholstery in your home. And I wanted to specifically talk about one of those fabrics here. So Natalie, we can move to the next slide.
Sam, before you get too far ahead, we had a question about the coverlet. They were asking, how was it made? Was it done by machine? Was it actually made done on a hand loom, or any ideas about the manufacture of it?
I believe it is machine made. Nora may jump in here to say for sure, I'm not sure, but I do believe it's machine made. It's made by a man named David Herring, and generally, as far as I know about coverlets, and I am no expert, generally men were machine making coverlets around this period, and it is split down the middle. There's two sides and then stitched together. And I think often that indicates the width of the loom on which it was woven.
I can jump in just a little bit. I didn't do a ton of research because I ran out of time in my own section on the coverlets, but there were women who were doing them in their house as well as these sort of like more production house ones. This would have been an example of a production house one. We can tell because of the manufacturer being male, but also by how delicate the designs are and how intricate the designs are. Typically the ones that were being produced in people's houses, mostly by women, would have been more geometric. And so they would have been like repeat patterns that were geometrically woven as opposed to these sort of fancy ones. But yeah, my understanding is as well that it was the loom width that determined the half width of the coverlets that you'd weave 2 lengths of and then sew them up the middle for both the production house versions and the at-home versions.
Thank you. And just really quickly, I want to talk about this because it carries both that eagle imagery and is an upholstery and drapery fabric. It was produced in 1942 and designed by a woman named Margarita Mergentime. Mergentime was born in 1894 and rose to popularity in the 1930s, and many of her designs were inspired by folk art and Americana. She worked in conjunction with many textile companies across the US and produced textiles that were in home and ladies magazines across the country. And she even designed some textiles that were used in Radio City Music Hall and for the World's Fair in New York in 1939. She passed in 1941, and many of her textiles are in holdings such as the Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian, Museum at FIT, and we are very lucky to have several of her, or a small collection of her textiles at the Helen, Louise Allen Textile Collection. This piece was created post-mortem, and because of the date, it likely carried a wartime sentiment, but again, we can't be sure of the intention of the producer. But to place it within that context does bring a new kind of weight to it and a different kind of character as well. Many of her pieces do feature American symbols and even text that highlights American themes and ideals. This piece utilizes the national seal and symbol, but it was so strange for me to see something that would adorn a private interior so loaded with national iconography. It seems to blur the lines between the personal and public, the private and the political. While Mergentime may have imagined it for a public building, it is a fabric with the weight of an upholstery fabric, and that is somewhat striking. We hold many other similar furnishing fabrics at the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection, as I said, with similar motifs, and they are all almost startling to view, thinking about them within the domestic space. However, that seems to be the purpose of their production. Today, it seems we often adorn the exteriors of our homes with political symbology using flags or yard signs, but it seems strange to see fabrics like this one. So yeah, with that, we do have some questions at the end, and one of the questions I have been thinking through is just whether others know of sort of political textiles that they have within their own homes. So as we're going along, thinking about that. But with that, I'll hand it over to Nora.
Hi. Pull my notes. So I'm Nora, and my section is craft making as a political action. Unlike my cohort here, I'm not actually a researcher. I'm not a historian. I'm a textile artist. I have an arts background. And one of my interests as a graduate student is in craft history, and craft theory. So I like to describe craft broadly as the circumstances under which a piece of material culture is produced. And for me, those big questions are what? So what gets made and made out of what? Like what kind of materials? How they get made, technical skills and technology it takes to produce an object. Who makes them? So who has the time and the resources to make, and also who profits from the making of those objects? And where, when? So where nationality, when within history, and the context in that regard. So we could ask every one of these questions about literally every object that we've chosen for the show, or really any object ever. But instead of creating a separate section in the show, my goal is to sort of create an experiential track that sort of goes through, explores these themes over the course of American history. And so for today, I've selected just 3 objects from different rooms of our show that I think embody these questions. So not as much of a deep dive as Natalie did, but similar. So if we can go to the first. Yeah, awesome. So what is this? This is a fabric roll-up needle case. So it is a fabric rectangle with a semicircle on the top, made from a variety of fabrics. On the outside, we have this sort of brown brocade fabric, and when you flip it over, you'll see that it actually has 7 pockets. Very exciting, it's got pockets. At the bottom, you can see that there are 4 semicircles of blue and red in various sizes, and those were probably to hold pins and needles. And at the top there, at the semicircle, you can see the initials HF are cross-stitched into the fabric. The case also has with it a bobbin with thread, a small lace sample, and a selection of other colors of threads that would have gone inside the case. So who made this piece? The case has the initials HF embroidered into the front and has been attributed to Helen Denise Foreman, who was alive between 1728 and 1789. And even though we don't know much about her, I've chosen to specifically call out her name because, as we'll see, craftspeople are frequently hidden from the eyes of history, especially craftspeople who are women and people of color. And the existence of the initials here not only served to personalize the object, but also helps us as historians paint a fuller picture of its creation and its use. We can go ahead to the next one. So this object was made between 1759 and 1789. Up until about 1750, American colonists were dependent on Britain for almost all of their textiles. In fact, legislation rendered production of fabric on American soil a treasonous act, which led to some very rebellious textile production, especially with weaving and with knitting. And in this way, to me, hand making and textiles specifically are integrally tied into the American Revolution. So while this simple item may not include overt political patriotic symbolism like we saw in Sam's presentation, it is a reflection of the politicized nature of that revolutionary era. And it's clear to me that it belongs in our exhibit. I also feel like the use of the red and blue flaps, especially with that white blanket stitching, it's a pretty clear reference to the American flag as well. So we can go forward. I chose to start with this piece not only because it's situated historically at the beginning of the American narrative, but also because it's such a great little nugget of hand making. It teaches us about what materials they had on hand. These were most likely scraps that were imported from Britain. A little bit about their construction methods. So that blanket stitching that I called out earlier is still a super commonly used technique that we teach and use today. And about what they anticipate needing for future projects with the thread color choices that we see within their case. Other historical examples of cases like this one have included spare buttons, beeswax for lubricating linen threads, and pins and needles of various sizes. We can also deduce that these items would be needed on the go, as the case can get rolled up and then easily tucked into a pocket or a bag. Another interesting tidbit about these needle cases is that they were frequently referred to as housewives or hussifs. And this nickname was mostly used by men who would take the cases, which were often made by their wives or other female relatives, with them when they went to sea or to war. And the insinuation here is that sewing and repairing clothes is strictly a wife's job, but with a wife absent, they could easily be replaced with the tools to do the job. So that's my first object. So this is my second object. This is an example of Victorian perforated paper embroidery. So what is it? It's a rectangle of perforated paper upon which the motto, "Welcome Home," has been embroidered, following a pre-printed design that was printed onto the fabric, or onto the paper. 2 US flags on poles form an X crossing the base of the wreath, and a banner stretches out underneath it. And we have this dated between 1870 and 1890. So when I started researching this object, I found that it was part of a trend called Victorian perforated paper embroideries, which was a popular trend between 1860 and 1900. So when I think of the Victorian era, I think very much like England-centric, sort of like British Victoriana, Sherlock Holmes, Smoky London, but it was also a complicated time globally. Civil War was happening in the US between 1861 and 1865, right at the beginning of this trend. And industry was sweeping the globe, and along with it, the double-edged sword of cheaply produced goods, which traded class-defying accessibility for environmental destruction and humanitarian abuses. Go to the next. So early perforated paper would have had a high rag content. So paper was made with a lot of textiles up until just about this point in history. The process for making fully cellulosic paper was being concurrently developed at the time of this trend. So this means the paper for these embroideries would have been fairly sturdy compared to what you might think of as paper feeling like today. And using perforated paper had a lot of benefits. It meant that stitchers didn't need to count the threads of their substrate, which if you do cross stitch, you know is very tedious. And you didn't have to fill in the background once that you had completed the design. Fun fact, when they were framed, they were frequently backed with crumpled tinfoil, which gave the pieces this like super twinkly look that you couldn't replicate with threads, even though some people did end up using like metallic threads and beads. A lot of them had this sort of tinfoil back. Most often, the thread materials and colors were left to the stitcher, although it's likely there were occasionally kits sold, or at least color guides printed in ladies' magazines that could act as a guide. So the mottos ranged in themes from religious to familial, but most seemed to fit the sort of greater Victorian ideal of moral exactitude, especially for women whose roles in society were becoming increasingly policed. You can sort of see this moral policing reflected in the whole trend. So whereas in the needle case that we looked at first, that really provided an infinite amount of creativity. But by the end of the 19th century, women were expected to follow directions. We've also lost the signature here. And while it wouldn't have been difficult to add initials, just like the ones that Helen Foreman stitched into her needle case, I haven't seen any examples of paper embroideries that include them. And certainly here, we don't have any indication of who might have been working on this piece. Variations on this home sweet home motto seemed to have been some of the most common. And we actually have 2 of these embroideries in our collection, both of which read welcome home, which is similar to home sweet home, but just slightly different. It's possible that the popularity of this welcome home ideology was driven by emotional fallout of the Civil War. Women were left at home while their husbands and brothers went off to war. They'd want to provide something welcoming for them to come home to, and also something to keep their hands busy while they were waiting. I think it's also interesting to note about the paper embroideries is that because the paper was cheaply produced, the paper embroideries were considered a poor person's craft. And along with this, many examples have been attributed to children and quote unquote invalids, as if these categories of makers were somehow lesser than, less skilled, less deserving, less valuable than the women who could afford to embroider more complicated designs into fully fabric pieces.
Nora, we
Yeah.
have a question about the embroidery. Did they use a frame like they would for needlepoint, or was it more freehand?
Honestly, I don't have any historical research to back that up, but from a sort of maker and tactile standpoint, I'm guessing it was probably freehand. Marina, jump in if you know anything more than this. Part of that is that I don't see any indication that there was like crunching or like coloration difference on the sides of the paper. I do know that they were produced in standard sizes, so they might have been clamped and then cut out, but I think it's important to remember how stiff that paper would have been. So it had such a high fiber count, like a high rag cotton count, that it may have felt much sturdier than working on fabric, which is sort of flopping. You use the frame to sort of hold it in place. So that would have been my guess, just from like a tactile hand making perspective. We're good to move on. Cool. Okay, so the last piece I'm going to talk about is this Lewis and Clark Centennial Exhibition handkerchief. So this is a cotton handkerchief with 2 separate forms of decoration. It has 4 red-crowned cranes, otherwise known as Japanese cranes, embroidered into the fabric, surrounded by decorative flowers. And then it also has 2 stamped images, one of an eagle with its wings outstretched, and the other of Lewis and Clark, along with the text, Centennial Exhibition, Portland, Oregon, June 1st, 1905. So the printing, at least, on this object would have been done at the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exhibition, which was also known as the Lewis and Clark Centennial and American Pacific Exhibition and Oriental Fair, which is a mouthful. And the fair was attended by over 2.5 million people over the course of its 4-month run. And the goal of the fair was to help boost the local economy and interest in Portland as a city, which it did with amazing success. The population increased over 3,000% in the years following the exhibition. The decision to celebrate Lewis and Clark actually came after the decision to host a fair, and seemingly mostly because the timing was good for that centennial anniversary. And the fair had booths from many US states and countries from around the world. The printing was apparently done with the same type of machinery that was used to print American currency. And it would have showcased advances in printing technology and created an interactive souvenir. I'm going to work a little quickly through my notes because I'm looking at the time here. We can tell that that this was done sort of as 2 separate stamps because it's like smooshed into the embroidery to keep it from printing on top of the embroidery, which is in comparison to like other objects that were printed at the same fair are sort of like more spread out and breathable. And while the embroidery was clearly done by hand, we don't know for sure whether it was done for the purpose of sale or whether it was done as like a leisure time activity. But I think it's likely that it was produced for sale and then purchased in the Oriental Fair part of that exhibition. This is a cool hybrid object for me because it's a hybrid between a mass-produced object, a hand-produced object meant for public consumption, and an individual personalization that commemorates a specific moment in time. And I know that I'm sort of harping about this anonymity thing here, but we know a lot about one of these makers and almost nothing about the other. There's a very sort of pleasingly succinct comparison between the American masculine act of stamping white male faces surrounded not only by aggressively patriotic symbols, but also actual text that explain who they are, the date of the occasion, never to be forgotten, and no excuses, while the embroidery is physically and visually delicate and completely anonymous. This kind of erasure has happened to women makers for centuries, and it's important to remember that it's also been a consistent tactic for undermining non-white makers to undervalue their creativity and erase their influence. It also hasn't escaped my notice that it's particularly ironic that Portland's success as a city was literally built on the back of Asian immigrants who had done all the work to build the railroads up the California coast, and also that Lewis and Clark are sort of emblematic of this westward expansion of colonialism that wiped out indigenous populations in that part of the country as well. So I'm going to stop there. I could do a deep dive on like every single object in this show happily, and there are so many good ones that I could have chosen from, but these are the 3 that I think really sort of dig into these issues of making really nicely.
Nora, there was another question that came up about the second piece, the paper. Was it incomplete or has it worn away?
Natalie, actually, if you want to go back, you can sort of see, I think what's really cool about some of the objects in our collection are that they are incomplete pieces. So you can see here with the L and the C, that would have been the printing directly on the paper that the embroiderer was then following on top of. So this isn't a complete piece. We actually get to see underneath it, which is really cool because we get a little bit more of a sense of what they were working with when they sat down to actually put needle to paper. Yeah, great question.
So I know we just have a couple minutes left, and I'm just going to say very few words about collecting, because we feel like that's a really important part of the way we're thinking about these objects. And I wanted to start really just showing one object from the collection, which I think really sums up why thinking about collecting is also really important to thinking about making. So if we can just see the paper dress. I think many people, when they see this dress now, associate it with September 11th, 2001. And certainly I've witnessed students or visitors to the collection sort of having that conversation about this dress. But this dress, as you see on the screen, was actually made in 1999. It was made by an artist named Sarah Kaplan. It was part of a series of 5 kind of graphic dresses made of Tyvek, the same thing we wrap our houses with when they're having work done. This is the one sort of urban scene of the 5. They were all different landscapes and seascapes, all kind of blue, all under this designation that she used of poster dresses, really inspired by paper dresses of the 1960s. However, we have really good evidence that this dress was very intentionally collected for the Helen Louise Allen Textile collection by the person who was then the curator, Marianne Fitzgerald. She wrote to Kaplan about a month after September 11th, asking if she had any more of these dresses, and really wanted to have this representation in the collection. And it's really interesting to think about how that act of singling this dress out from the set of 5 of which it was originally a part, and sort of thinking about the moment of its collecting has really changed, I think, the subsequent interpretation and meaning. And this is something that we've been thinking about really with all of the objects that we've been looking at is, how were they made, but also why do we have them? Why are they saved? And that also raises some really important questions about what we don't have. And we've been reflecting all year on the fact that while the Helen, Louise, Allen Textile Collection is really global in its reach, and represents many different types of peoples, it's North American holdings. These things we've been showing you that represent American politics actually represent a fairly narrow section of the population. And we've been all the more aware of this over the past month or 6 weeks or so, as issues of representation have entered so much into the public dialogue. And so while we decided to work within the constraints of our own collection and really show what's there, we're also really hoping to use this exhibit as an opportunity to think about what more we could collect that might allow us to tell a more inclusive story about American politics. And I'm going to just actually end with a slide of things that we don't have in our collection, things that represent suffrage or civil rights of various kinds. And just to say that, this is an area that we're going to be looking to expand upon. And also that we'd be really interested in knowing people's views about what other kinds of textiles we could collect that would help us to tell a more inclusive story. So I think we're almost out of time, but I think we can all stick around if anyone has any additional questions. We have a couple of questions for you that are on the next slide. So if you want to get in touch with us afterwards or give us some ideas now in the chat, we would be happy to hear them. But again, I just want to thank Melissa and her team for this opportunity to share some of the research we've done. And we hope that when this exhibit finally gets put into a gallery space, you will all come and see it.
And I'd like to echo my thanks for the 4 of you sharing the research with all of us. It's been a fascinating kind of insight into some of what's in the collection, yes, but how we collect, what we collect, why we collect what we do. And for those of you, I see a few of you are starting to put things, so some of the answers to your questions or some of the things that they'd like to see. So I will share if you are putting the things in the chat, all of the panelists can see that, and we'll also be sharing the chat, the full chat after the program with the panelists. So they'll have all of those, the opportunity to see all of those sorts of things as well. So some of the ones, just in case you guys aren't seeing them, t-shirts as political things, masks right now. Some of the slave quilts, the AIDS quilts. Are you currently collecting anything related to the quarantine? Like things right now that are actually happening. So those are some of the ones that are coming up right now. And are you guys, collecting anything? The museum has actually started this huge quarantine quilt project, but have you guys done anything related to this, related to collecting?
Natalie talking. Yes. Well, right now we are working on a project where we're collecting COVID masks for the textile collection. And that's been a really wonderful project to work on. We're sort of taking the model of what's called rapid response collecting that museums have been doing for a little while, but I think the VNA termed or coined that term a few years ago, where museums really try and react to contemporary events and collect items that that can allow them to interpret those events in their galleries. So we have a number of different COVID masks that we're collecting that relate to all the different discussions that these masks are part of, including the most recent Black Lives Matter protests, Indigenous identities, and how Indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID, the role of women's labor and during the pandemic, or just in general, like craftspersons' labor as skilled makers who are creating these masks, and as well as notions about sort of technology and what sorts of fabrics are being used, and like childhood experiences of COVID, and how they'll be wearing masks when they go back to school. So we've been trying to think about all of the different ways that masks are kind of bringing up many different discussions about society right now, and the way that we can use some of these masks as a way to discuss that, and the new role sort of that textiles are playing in our everyday lives as COVID masks.
And then from Devin, probably directed mostly at, I would think, Nora, although if the others are makers too. Are any of you doing blocks for the quarantine quilt that we're making, so the museum's project? Or would you be willing to do it?
It definitely came across my dash right when you guys posted about it, but I've actually been sewing too many masks, so I haven't had a lot of time to work on like fun creative projects, which has been a bit sad. So I know that there's been a couple of calls for these quilts, but I haven't had a chance to. It sounds like you have a lot. I don't know, do you want more? It's like you've got so many already.
Well, that's been one of the things for us that's been so fun. It's documenting what's going on. You know, it's documenting what's actually happened over the last few months in this kind of changed world that we found ourselves in because of the pandemic. So it's been fun for us to see how the blocks are coming in, because we keep saying each one of them is as unique as the person who made it. And yes, you can say that for a lot of art, but I mean, it really is capturing this snapshot in time, and how people are dealing with it, whether it's a message of hope, a message about what's going on politically, their experience with it, or about the masks themselves. I mean, some of them are very COVID specific. So it's really interesting for us to see how everybody is kind of interpreting those sorts of things differently. So, any final thoughts before we say farewell?
No, just thank you again for partnering with us. It's been great.
Oh, thank you guys, ladies, all. We really appreciate you joining us. Again, as a final reminder, that the programs that we do are free, but donations are greatly appreciated. It allows us to continue doing things like this, and having fun with things like this. We are really lucky to have some, incredible talent that's just up the road from us. You guys aren't too far away. So again, thank you for joining us again. And for those that are tuning in each week to these programs, we are skipping next week because of Independence Day. So our next Friday lunch program will be on July 10th at noon. So the information is already on the museum's website and in our weekly newsletter, The Barn Blast, and on Facebook. So stay tuned at those locations for more information about upcoming things. And with that, thank you all very much.
Thanks so much for having us. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you so much for letting us share.